Steam curled upward from the dented metal mug, carrying with it a smell so rich, so foreign, that for a moment the entire camp seemed to pause. A German woman, her hair matted, her clothes hanging loose on her frame, lifted the cup with trembling hands. She had heard rumors about this drink, but hadn't tasted it in years. Some of the younger women standing beside her had never tasted it at all. The Americans called it coffee. To them it was routine. To her it was nothing short of unbelievable. The war had taken nearly everything. Food, safety, family, gone or shattered. What remained was ration substitutes, bitter mixtures of roasted acorns or ground barley that pretended to be coffee but fooled no one. The smell of the real thing had vanished from German kitchens long before defeat arrived. And now, suddenly, here it was again, handed over casually by the very people she had been told were enemies. The woman hesitated. She remembered the warnings. Propaganda had painted Americans as cruel and corrupt, men who would mock, humiliate, and strip away whatever dignity prisoners still clung to. Taking anything from them was supposed to feel dangerous. But her hunger, her weariness, her buried memories tugged harder. She brought the cup to her lips. The first sip shocked her. The flavor was sharp, almost biting, but layered with warmth that spread quickly down her throat. She closed her eyes. For the first time in years, her body responded not to fear or exhaustion, but to comfort. It was more than a drink. It was a reminder of life before the world had collapsed. For an instant, she was no longer behind barbed wire. She was home, in a kitchen where her mother once poured steaming cups into clinking porcelain, where laughter filled the air. Around her, other women reacted much the same way. Some whispered in disbelief, others laughed nervously, as though they weren't allowed to enjoy it. A few clutched their mugs tightly, refusing to let them go even after they had drained the last drop, holding on to the warmth as if it might slip away forever. In a place where survival usually meant silence, now there was chatter, laughter even, and at the center of it all was the coffee. The Americans didn't seem to understand the depth of this reaction. To them, coffee was part of every day. They drank it at dawn, before patrols, after meals. It came in their rations as naturally as bread or cigarettes. Offering it to prisoners wasn't strategy, it was routine hospitality. Yet what was ordinary to them became extraordinary to the women. That was the strange magic of the moment. Coffee wasn't necessary. It didn't fill an empty stomach the way bread did, didn't restore strength like meat or soup. It was unnecessary in the strictest sense. But that's exactly why it mattered so much. After years of scarcity, something unnecessary felt like treasure. It didn't just nourish, it restored. One American guard noticed the way the women cradled their cups, as though afraid the mugs would vanish if they let go. He chuckled, remarking that they looked like they'd never had coffee before. He didn't realize that, for many, it was true. The blockade and shortages had erased real beans from daily life long before these women were captured. For the younger ones, this wasn't nostalgia, it was discovery. The camp itself seemed to change. Usually filled with the sounds of boots, clattering tin, and the dull routine of captivity, it now carried a different rhythm. Women huddled together, cups in hand, comparing the taste, sharing old memories, or simply savoring in silence. The steam rising into the cold air became more than vapor. It became a signal. Here was something that reminded them they were still human. But coffee also carried contradictions. Was it a gesture of kindness or a calculated move to soften prisoners? Did it matter? The women debated quietly among themselves. Some said it was manipulation, an attempt to win them over with sweetness. Others rejected that thought, insisting that no matter the reason, the taste was real and could not be taken away. For once, they chose to enjoy without questioning too deeply. The first sip was unforgettable, not just for the flavor but for the shift it created. These women were not soldiers, not combatants, yet they were branded as enemies all the same. Coffee blurred that line. It was impossible to sip without feeling the barrier soften, if only slightly. The guards, handing out cups, seemed less like faceless captors and more like men sharing something from their world. The women, receiving them, felt less like prisoners and more like people. Later, long after they were released, many of these women would remember the coffee more vividly than almost anything else from captivity. They wouldn't recall every guard's name, or each roll call, or even every punishment, but they remembered that first sip, the way it cut through despair, the way it reminded them of who they had been, the way it hinted at who they might still become. And so the story begins, not with battlefields or speeches, but with a steaming cup, a hesitant sip, and the sudden, almost magical realization that even in the ruins of war, life could still surprise you with warmth. Life inside the camp was not built for comfort. Barbed wire stretched in every direction, enclosing rows of barracks that offered shelter but little else. The wooden walls carried the smell of damp straw and sweat, and the air inside was always heavy, as if it refused to circulate. For the German women confined there, survival was a daily calculation. How to stretch a ration, how to barter, how to keep a sense of dignity when almost everything else had been stripped away. Food was predictable in its scarcity. A piece of bread, sometimes hard enough to cut the mouth. A thin soup, more water than vegetable. Once in a while, meat appeared, though hardly enough to satisfy. The hunger was not sharp anymore. It had dulled into a constant, slow ache, the kind that gnawed at the body while settling like a weight in the mind. The women learned to live with it, though it left their faces hollow and their steps slower. Into this monotony came the coffee. The day it appeared, the camp's rhythm shifted. Soldiers carried in tins of American rations, ground beans sealed in neat packages that seemed like artifacts from another world. The smell alone caused murmurs to spread quickly through the barracks. The guards ladled it into battered cups, steam curling upward, and placed them into waiting hands. It was not enough to fill an empty stomach, but it was more than food. It was luxury. For many of the women, it was the first time they had been given something that wasn't purely about survival. Bread was survival. Water was survival. Even the straw they slept on was survival. But coffee was indulgence. And indulgence in captivity felt almost revolutionary. One woman, a former teacher, whispered to the others as she sipped, "This is what civilization tastes like." The phrase stuck. They repeated it with laughter that startled even themselves. It was the kind of laughter that rose not from humor, but from disbelief that something so small could feel so large. The Americans noticed. They were accustomed to drinking coffee on the march, in the trenches, in mess tents. It was their constant companion, their fuel through sleepless nights and long patrols. Seeing their prisoners react with such awe amused them, but it also puzzled them. They had never thought of coffee as rare, let alone magical. Conversations between guards and prisoners began to change. The cup of coffee served as a starting point, softening the silence that usually defined their encounters. A guard might joke that the women drank faster than his own squad. A prisoner might ask for another serving, and the request would be met not with suspicion, but with a shrug and sometimes even a smile. The smallest exchanges mattered. A nod, a chuckle, a brief word shared over the simple act of drinking. These were not alliances or friendships. War still hung heavily in the air, mistrust still ran deep, but for the first time the barrier was less absolute. The women began to see the guards not only as uniforms but as men. The guards, in turn, saw prisoners who could laugh, who could savor, who could be delighted by something as ordinary as a hot drink. Not every woman accepted it easily. Some refused at first, clutching their distrust more tightly than their hunger. They worried about tricks, about humiliation, about appearing weak in front of their captors. A few set their cups down untouched, unwilling to give the Americans the satisfaction of seeing them enjoy it. Yet even among them, the smell lingered, impossible to ignore. Over time, most gave in. Resistance crumbled not under orders, but under the pull of aroma and memory. Those who had known coffee before the war felt a flood of recollections. They remembered breakfast tables with family, porcelain cups rattling against saucers, conversations about trivial things that suddenly seemed golden. Those who had never tasted it before stored away the moment as something sacred, the day they first learned what real coffee was. At night, lying on their straw beds, they talked quietly about it, describing flavors as though they were poets. Some said it was bitter but good, Others claimed it was strong enough to wake the dead. They exaggerated, joked, and laughed softly in the dark, and for a few hours the camp felt less like a prison. The coffee did not erase hunger. It did not undo loss. It did not change the fact that they were captives far from home, unsure of what would come next. But it proved something vital, that even in captivity, joy could sneak in through the smallest crack. And so, within the barbed wire, a paradox took shape. A war that had destroyed millions of lives, left cities in ruins, and scattered families across continents was suddenly interrupted by mugs of coffee. For the women who held those mugs, the war was still real, still raw, but it was no longer the only reality. There was also warmth, flavor, and the reminder that life could surprise them. The story of the coffee spread quickly, beyond the first sip, beyond the first day. It became part of camp lore, retold whenever hope seemed in short supply. And each retelling strengthened the sense that something had shifted. The American guards didn't plan it this way. They didn't strategize kindness or design psychological relief. They had simply shared what they considered routine. Yet, unknowingly, they had created a moment that the women would carry for the rest of their lives. The first sip had been astonishing, but the days that followed, when the ritual continued, turned it into something even more powerful. A rhythm, a thread of continuity that tied them to a life beyond captivity. As the days went on, the coffee ritual became a quiet anchor in the unpredictable rhythm of camp life. The morning lines stretched along the barracks, women shivering in the cold, cups clutched tightly in their hands. Some lingered over each sip, savoring warmth more than taste. Others gulped quickly, eager to join friends in small conversations that had been impossible before. The act of drinking coffee, simple as it seemed, became a ritual of survival in itself. For many, it was not just nourishment but a reconnection with the world they had lost. The older women spoke of kitchens long abandoned, of family breakfasts and the clatter of spoons against china. Younger women, who had grown up during the war, discovered something entirely new. A flavor and aroma they had never known, an indulgence previously inaccessible. Each cup felt like a bridge to a world beyond the fences and watchtowers. Conversations began to bloom around the coffee. Anna, a former factory worker, explained to others how the Americans brewed it, sharing small details she had picked up. She described the beans, the way the soldiers measured and boiled them, even the faint bitterness mixed with warmth. The women listened intently, their imaginations filling in gaps with memories of kitchens they had never fully experienced or had forgotten. Small groups formed spontaneously, clusters of women holding mugs and exchanging stories. Laughter, once scarce and cautious, began to rise from these circles. Even brief jokes or shared smiles felt like revolutions against the drabness of camp life. Coffee, a simple drink in ordinary circumstances, became a medium for reclaiming small parts of identity that the war had stripped away. The Americans noticed these subtle changes. At first, it seemed amusing that such a routine beverage could provoke such reactions. But over time, soldiers saw the effect it had on morale. Women who had appeared broken were now engaged, animated, momentarily transformed by something so ordinary in their own culture. These shared moments, however brief, softened the rigid boundaries of captivity. Yet the coffee ritual was not free from tension. Some women remained skeptical, viewing the Americans' generosity with suspicion. Accepting the drink felt like compromising pride or conceding in a war they were already losing. Others worried it was manipulation, a subtle attempt to turn prisoners into compliant subjects. These doubts were whispered among themselves, but ultimately, the warmth and flavor won over hesitation in most cases. The guards maintained control, of course, reminding women they were prisoners and enforcing limits on portions. But even these small gestures of authority could not undo the impact of the ritual. Coffee had become a shared experience that briefly transcended roles, uniforms, and suspicion. It created a space where captors and captives could interact on the simplest, most human level, through taste, warmth, and small conversation. In the evenings, discussions continued quietly in the barracks. Women replayed the mornings in memory, recalling details of flavor, the rising steam, the subtle gestures of soldiers. Coffee became the focal point of recollection, the moment that lingered in memory far longer than any official instruction, inspection, or punishment. Through these small daily encounters, the camp began to feel less oppressive. The women weren't free, but they were, in fleeting moments, more than prisoners. They were people capable of delight, of savoring, of sharing experiences. The simple act of sipping a warm drink offered a reminder that humanity survived even in the bleakest conditions. Even the Americans began to notice how much the ritual meant. Casual observations turned into small gestures. An extra ladle, a smile, a brief conversation in broken German. For soldiers accustomed to routines and rations, these were minor acts. But in the camp, they rippled outward, reinforcing bonds. Fragile, temporary, yet significant. The magic of the first sip remained, but now it was accompanied by a rhythm, a repeated ritual that anchored the day. Each cup poured and shared reinforced a sense of continuity and small pleasure. The women began to plan around it, adjusting their movements and expectations to include these few minutes of warmth and taste. Coffee was no longer incidental. It was essential, not for survival, strictly speaking, but for the survival of spirit. And so the cycle continued. Morning brewing, steaming mugs, hesitant sips turning into laughter, whispered stories, and stolen moments of humanity. A beverage that seemed mundane to its providers had become transformative for its recipients. It wasn't just flavor or warmth. It was the subtle, quiet restoration of identity in a place designed to erase it. The women knew the war was not over. The fences remained. The guards remained. Hunger and exhaustion persisted. But coffee introduced a crack in the rigidity of captivity, a momentary opening where life could feel ordinary again. For a few minutes each morning, the impossible felt possible. Warmth, taste, and the reminder that they had not been reduced entirely to prisoners. The coffee ritual began to ripple beyond individual enjoyment, becoming a subtle framework around which life in the camp organized itself. Women who once moved silently and separately started forming small circles, cups in hand, sharing stories and quiet laughter. Conversation replaced the oppressive stillness, though always beneath the shadow of barbed wire and watchtowers. The coffee didn't eliminate fear or hunger, but it offered a shared anchor, a common thread in an otherwise fragmented existence. Even the soldiers noticed the transformation. They had expected resentment, mistrust, maybe even defiance. Instead, they saw the women interacting, drawing closer, showing glimpses of personality that had been buried under months or years of captivity. For the guards, these interactions were perplexing, sometimes frustrating, sometimes quietly gratifying. Their cups of coffee, meant as small comforts, had unwittingly created an atmosphere of fragile humanity. Some women used the ritual as a tool to assert a small measure of control. By showing patience, refusing the first ladle, or carefully sharing with others, they subtly reshaped the dynamics of the camp. Coffee, a seemingly minor luxury, became a vehicle for agency. It was a chance to reclaim a fragment of autonomy, deciding how much to drink, when to speak, and with whom to share their experience. These small acts did not go unnoticed. Soldiers occasionally remarked on the resilience of the women, the way they found rhythm and meaning in something so ordinary. The ritual blurred lines, not entirely, but enough to remind both captives and captors of a shared humanity. In these moments, the distinctions of enemy and prisoner softened, revealing people beneath uniforms, beyond labels. The psychological effect of the coffee ritual was profound. Women reported feeling lighter, more awake, more willing to engage with the day. Sleep felt deeper after a morning ritual, conversations seemed richer, and small joys returned, like laughter echoing off wooden walls. In a place designed to strip identity and hope, coffee became a subtle instrument of emotional survival. Not every interaction was harmonious. Some women resisted the ritual, clinging to suspicion or pride. Others observed quietly, unwilling to risk appearing weak. Yet even these women were affected by the aroma, the warmth, and the collective experience surrounding each mug. Resistance did not prevent the magic of coffee from infiltrating consciousness. altering perceptions of captivity in small but meaningful ways. The soldiers, meanwhile, began recognizing their unintended role in this transformation. They were witnesses, sometimes participants, in moments of quiet resilience. A ladle of coffee was not a declaration of victory, but a shared ritual of life. The act of giving became a gesture that bridged experiences, offering a temporary reprieve from the rigid realities of war. Women began to integrate the coffee ritual into their daily mental maps, planning their movements and interactions around it. They saved whispers, stories, and laughter for these moments, creating social bonds that extended beyond simple survival. The drink itself became a symbol of connection, a fleeting but potent reminder of life outside the fences. Over time, the ritual carried symbolic weight. Coffee represented more than warmth or taste. It became a marker of endurance, a ritual of remembrance and resilience. Each cup reflected both the small pleasures that remained and the stark contrast with the deprivation and hardship that dominated the rest of their days. It reminded them that even in captivity, humanity persisted. The stories of these mornings would persist long after the camp dissolved. Women who experienced the ritual recalled the precise smell, the rising steam, the warmth spreading through their hands. Decades later, memories of these cups of coffee carried as much meaning as the larger events of the war itself. They remembered not the barbed wire or the uniformed guards, but the taste, the ritual, and the small acts of humanity that had pierced the monotony of captivity. Coffee had become more than drink. It was a quiet revolution of spirit. It restored fragments of self, nurtured fleeting joy, and allowed human connection to survive in a place built to strip it away. The American soldiers had no intention of creating history with a tin of coffee, yet history was quietly being made, one cup at a time. The ritual of coffee began to take on a deeply personal dimension for the women. Each cup carried its own story, memory, and meaning. Marta, who had once clutched her first sip as if it were a treasure, began keeping a small journal in the evenings. She recorded the morning's moments, the laughter that had escaped the barracks, the brief exchanges with soldiers, and even the subtle gestures that went unnoticed by others. To her, coffee had become a lens through which life in captivity could be understood and endured. Anna, the former factory worker, turned her fascination into action. She observed how the soldiers brewed and measured, then taught other women to approximate the technique using whatever utensils were available. It was a small defiance, a reclaiming of knowledge that allowed them to feel capable, even in confinement. The process became communal. Women huddled together, whispering tips and improvising methods to make the thin rations of coffee stretch farther. In this shared experimentation, camaraderie bloomed. These daily routines formed more than habits. They became rituals of survival and resilience. The women started to treat each cup as an event. The first sip in the morning was always solemn, accompanied by hushed admiration of aroma and warmth. Conversations were reserved for later sips, ensuring that the act of drinking remained sacred. The cup became a symbol, small but potent, that preserved dignity within the barbed wire walls. Even the soldiers noticed the effect of their daily offerings. Some began to linger, observing the women's interactions and realizing that these moments were quietly reshaping the camp's social dynamics. Bonds formed between individuals, some fleeting and some lasting, bridged by a beverage that neither hunger nor fear could entirely overshadow. Coffee became a shared language of humanity. The psychological impact extended beyond immediate pleasure. Women who participated in the ritual reported feeling stronger, calmer, and more capable of navigating the daily hardships of camp life. The warmth of a cup, the familiar taste, and the act of sharing nurtured mental endurance. Coffee was not a cure for hunger or confinement, but it provided a profound reminder that small comforts could sustain the human spirit. Over time, personal stories intertwined with collective memory. Women recounted mornings when laughter rose above the usual silence, when small groups whispered jokes or shared fragments of family life. These recollections became treasures, passed quietly from one prisoner to another. Coffee became a connective thread, tying individual experiences together and creating a subtle, persistent culture of hope. Even in moments of strict discipline or limited rations, the ritual persisted. Women found ways to honor it despite oversight, finding small places for privacy or improvising with what they had. This adaptability highlighted the extraordinary resilience that coffee had inadvertently fostered. It was no longer just a beverage, it was a catalyst for emotional and social survival. In later years, the women reflected on the significance of these moments. They recalled the smell, the warmth, the fleeting freedom in which they could savor something ordinary yet extraordinary. The coffee's impact transcended the physical. It had revived memory, identity, and community. A simple drink became emblematic of what endurance looked like under the harshest conditions. The ritual's influence extended even further. When stories of the camp circulated after the war, they carried more than accounts of suffering. They carried the memory of coffee, a symbol of humanity persisting amid deprivation. For those who had experienced it, the drink came to represent continuity, hope, and the quiet power of small, shared pleasures. And so, the cups continued to circulate each morning, steaming and fragrant, nurturing spirits, connecting lives, and leaving an imprint that would endure long after the war's end. What began as an ordinary ration evolved into a profound, collective testament to resilience, identity, and the unexpected magic of warmth shared. As the war ended and the camps slowly emptied, the memories of coffee lingered. The barbed wire remained in photographs, the uniforms in fading snapshots, but the ritual of morning cups had left an indelible mark on those who had lived it. Women carried these experiences quietly, tucked into their minds like secret treasures, their significance growing over time. The act of drinking coffee in captivity had been simple, almost mundane, yet it had transformed lives in subtle, profound ways. It restored dignity in a world designed to erase it. It fostered small acts of resistance, enabling women to reclaim control over moments of their day. It cultivated camaraderie, creating bonds that would survive beyond the fences and the uniformed guards. The soldiers, too, remembered. Many noted that their small gestures, meant as routine, perhaps even inconsequential, had sparked resilience and joy in the lives of prisoners. They had unknowingly participated in creating a space where humanity could persist despite hardship. Their contribution was neither heroic nor strategic, but it was undeniable. A cup of coffee, shared without expectation, had become a vehicle for connection. In the post-war years, these memories shaped narratives far beyond the camp. Women recounted them to children and grandchildren, preserving the aroma, the warmth, and the feeling of shared humanity. In memoirs and interviews, the coffee ritual was often described not just as a comfort, but as a symbol, a marker of endurance, adaptability, and the quiet miracles that sustained life during the darkest times. Cultural historians later reflected on these moments, noting how something as ordinary as coffee could carry extraordinary significance. In a society emerging from devastation, the smallest comforts could become monumental. Coffee, in this context, represented more than flavor. It embodied generosity, memory, resilience, and the subtle reclamation of agency under oppression. The legacy of the first sip endured in unexpected ways. Post-war Germany saw the resurgence of coffee culture, coffee houses reopened, and the beverage regained its status as a daily ritual. For some women, each cup served years later recalled mornings in the camp, the laughter, the whispered stories, the fleeting reprieve from despair. It became a bridge between past and present, a reminder that humanity can survive even when life feels stripped bare. Ultimately, the story of these women and their first taste of American coffee is a testament to the power of small acts. It shows that even in captivity, joy and dignity can be found, that a steaming cup, simple in itself, can restore identity, nurture resilience, and spark connection. It illustrates how ordinary gestures can carry extraordinary weight, how kindness, without strategy or expectation, can transform lives. The memory of coffee in the camp persists not only in personal recollections but also in the broader understanding of human endurance. It reminds us that even amid war, scarcity, and suffering, small pleasures can shape history, sustain spirits, and leave a mark far more lasting than walls or wire. For the German women who took that first sip, it was pure magic. Not in the sense of fantasy, but in the quiet, undeniable transformation it brought to their lives. In a world of loss and uncertainty, coffee became a ritual, a refuge, and a symbol of hope. And as long as those stories are told, the magic endures.